welcome to this week's edition of the Workers' World Labour Show in our new time slot of 7 p.m. I'm your host, Helga Janssen-Daubia. We're back in studio at Cape Town TV with our limited crew. Workers' World Labour Show and Cape Town TV adheres to all COVID-19 protocols in an effort to keep our crew and our guests safe. And for this reason, our guests are in a virtual studio coming to you via Zoom. Again, welcome to you at home, around Cape Town, around South Africa, and around the world with a welcome to our BRICS TV viewers. The COVID-19 pandemic has severely affected the world's people. Millions have been infected by the virus, and billions of workers' livelihoods and lives have been negatively impacted. The pandemic has had severe and disruptive effect on people's job security and on the social structure of their lives. We are aware of South Africa's historical crisis of poverty, now made worse by the COVID-19 pandemic. In today's show, we look at the plight of rural workers, the poor, and their struggle to survive under conditions of COVID-19. Before we get into our studio discussion, let's take a look at an insert produced by the Workers' World Media Productions.
Rural people in the former homelands suffer from oppressions, unaccountable rule that cannot be believed to exist under a democratic dispensation. This happens under the rule of tribal chiefs who got huge powers from the period of apartheid and colonialism, whereas those powers go against the customary system of accountable power. The customary system does not elevate power to chiefs, but ensures there are checks and balances, right from the family to the community, to the neighborhood, to the whole village, and indeed to the whole community.
Bolwetse jwa COVID-19 bo ramile kudu re le badudi ba ga mphahlele ka moka ka baka la re bontši jwa rena ga re bereke ba sa berekego be ba bereka mešongwana ya di-piece job. Jwale COVID ba tswalletše ka malapeng ga ba sa kgona go dira mešongwana ela go ra gore tlala e fihlile ka gare ga malapa. Jwalo masepala o ile wa leka go tšama o e fa batho dijo mara ga wa kgona go hlakanya bana ba tšegala ka moka e sa le ba bantši ba ba šetšego ba sa nyakang dijo.
No, the COVID-19 pandemic, like in many parts of South Africa, Limpopo has also been affected, more especially that we are a rural province, and a number of our community members had to confine themselves at home.
Lesule le ba mmile ga bohloko ka ge thoma ba re dule ka magae ska ra sepela pero sa sepele re phela dule ka magae especially ka level ya mathomo. That's why dilo tse di ngata ga re tsebe tse ba di dira mo.
Number of households did not have ends meet. They did not have money to buy groceries and other basic amenities. That's where we activated our SRD program. This is a program where we identify vulnerable households or households that are being identified as food insecure. That's where we move in as the department, get our social workers to conduct assessments, and those who are qualifying will then receive food parcels from the department.
Batho ba mo ga mphahlele ba qualify di food parcel ke ba bantši ba ka feta 500 mare ga se ba tša kgona ba fihlelela mathata gore se ke ja ba fihlelela ba councilor ba rena be go nne palo e ba fileng yona ya dijo mare ga tša kgona go cover batho ba ka moka ka baka la gore mphahlele ko mogolo o nabile.
In the Eastern Cape in particular, you have a context where the rural municipalities, where elected councillors serve, have been failing due to limited human resources, limited budgets, but just inefficiencies as well as corruption, even at the smallest local municipality in a rural context. Their councillors have been at war with each other over the small tenders that municipality issues. that takes away the attention of the councillors from service delivery. So there are these three problems, in other words, in the rural areas. There is the chieftaincy, there is the collapsed local government, and there's basically a poor state of the economy, which means massive unemployment.
And e re amile gape kudu le metsi ka baka la COVID-19 e re tlhape matsogo gafetša after 20 seconds engwe le engwe re hlape.
Isimo samanzi sibi kakhulu kangangokuba yiyo loo nto saye sagqiba ekubeni sihlale phansi sibe kanti sicela amanzi kuba ukusokola ngamanzi siqale ngo-2018.
Wona amanzi akekho endaweni akube ngathi kungabhetele kuya kuba west abantu phaya kukho abantu abahambisayo bayatyatyaza zizisu ngenxa yongabikho kwamanzi angawo asinamanzi.
Ngela xesha le-lockdown ikungeli xesha kwimbalela bekunzima into yokuba singawafumana amanzi kunyanzeleke into yokuba ibe ndim umntu ozawuzama into yokuba umntu makafumane amanzi noba uwafumene kanjani na or uyowakhe emlanjeni but bendizama kangangoko into yokuba at least abantu bawafumana amanzi. Awacocekanga sisi. Awacocekanga at all.
So when COVID hit, the lockdown started, what we began to see was a return of young people and others who were working in the urban centers of Johannesburg, Cape Town, Port Elizabeth, East London, and elsewhere, because they had lost their jobs. So that means that the families which depended on those jobs now had their income suddenly shut. But also there was a small number of people who passed away, who were affected by COVID, who were breadwinners. So that also affected families in quite a severe way. Also what happened is the closure of the schools meant that poor families could no longer guarantee that 1 meal a day that their children were getting from the school feeding program at school. So then all of a sudden, poor families have children with them all day, and there was no alternative provision of food to individual homes by government in the rural villages. But also there was a drought preceding COVID-19, which meant that given that there's no running water, people have to collect water from rain and keep that water in tanks or from rivers. And often the municipal water taps that are at every 200 meters are not necessarily running all the time. In many months they run dry. So then rural communities were left without the most basic precautionary measure to guard themselves against COVID-19.
You've just watched an insert produced by the Workers' World Media Productions editorial team. We'll be back after these messages. Welcome back. You're watching the Workers' World Labour Show. We're talking the conditions of rural workers and COVID-19. And joining us, and we can truly say tonight we've got a national show. We're joined by Bonani Lolilwa, Head of Administration from the Vulamasangu Singeni social movement all the way in the Eastern Cape with a specific area focus of the Ciskei and the Transkei. Welcome, Bonani.
Welcome to you and the viewers at home.
It's great to have you with us. We also joined from the West Coast, Davinia Witboy, who is, let me get this right, Davinia. You are the convener for the West Coast Food Sovereignty and Solidarity Forum in Lutzville. But the forum is also linked to the Landless People's Movement. And you're also a member of the global Via Campesina. So welcome to you. Truly a global guest.
Thank you.
That was a mouthful, yes.
Good evening, everyone.
Great to have you with us. And finally, from the Maibuye Land Rights Forum, an organizer, Dinia Jansen. Good evening to you, Dinia, and thank you for joining us.
Good evening to the viewers, and thanks for having us.
Welcome to all of you. Bonani, let's start with you before we get into the topic. Describe to us the conditions of the majority of rural people before COVID-19. What was the conditions of rural workers before COVID-19?
Thank you very much. Firstly, let me try by putting that the word rural in the Eastern Cape will mean farm dwellers and workers, which are mainly found in the former South Africa in terms of boundary demarcations at that time. And also majority of people that are within what is called traditional areas, which is communal land, which are normally the most vulnerable in terms of have less or having unfortunate situation. So if you talk about COVID, you're talking about the impact of COVID in these spaces. You're talking about the seasonal workers, which are working in the orange areas in province, Parasatman part, which is on the way to PE, as well as those that are living in villages, whom for quite some time in history of South Africa, they have less services, poor roads. They have to travel some 10 kilometers to clinics. In actual fact, less lack of service delivery at all. They've been with this situation for quite some time. Less availability of water, which was key during the COVID. I will mention a plethora of what is lacking when you define the rural in the Eastern Cape. And I don't know whether to stop there, but I'm just defining first what is rural in a sense here.
So, Bonani, rural is not only people who work on farms. This is a rural society. Let me bring Davina into this part of the conversation, Davina. Just remind us of the historical reasons for the situation that Bongani describes, which is a lack of access to water, a lack of access to services, which predates COVID-19. Davina?
Yes.
Yeah.
We must remember that we are in the West Coast, at the edge of the West Coast, towards Namakwalan. So it's difficult for people to get access to all those promises of government. And if we look at the historical background, is that we come from the Khoisan, the Namas, and also the Griquas. This was the indigenous people that lives amongst this land for many, many years and practice agriculture in their way. And when people were displaced from the land, there's another agricultural practicing was taking place, and people need to follow that. And also government is also supporting the chemical model of farming. So the problem that we are facing is that the language is a big major problem when we look into these areas where we are 400 to 500 kilometers away from the city, Cape Town. So it's difficult for people to understand because most of the people living amongst us is people that was early dropouts. You get people that never went to a school because they need to work on the farms. And that is a problem that our people face. They can't understand what message government want to send to the people because most of the time people are speaking English and our people understand Afrikaans. So it's difficult for our people. And that's why we are in the community helping the people to understand the message that come from government. So we are just a channel to bring the message to the people. Thank you.
So there's definitely a communication block between rural society and the state because of the way in which, firstly, English is the language of the economy, it is the language of the state, and there isn't a bridge to communicate with people. Dinia, I want to bring in you in here, the Maibuyu Land Rights Forum. So the question is, how has COVID-19 affected the rural, the agricultural economy? And I want to preface that question with a ILO, International Labour Organization 2020 brief, which says that a quarter of the global agricultural workers live in poverty and in food insecurity. That's really a bit of a, it doesn't seem as if it matches. The very people who help to produce our food are themselves without food. Dinia?
Yeah, this is a big question. Um, if we talk about the agriculture side of sector and how COVID-19 has affected especially farm workers and those seasonal workers. I mean, I've saw and we work together with the SAU as the Farm Worker Union. And during COVID-19, it was clear that farm workers were in the were also said they are essential workers. But when you look at the essential workers, I mean, they was the most vulnerable side of the society when it comes to COVID-19. I mean, even before COVID-19, there were so many problems on farms. And also, as you said, that already before COVID-19, people already went hungry, and farm workers work under very bad conditions and living conditions. And COVID has come and it just worsened the situation on farms. Even though the president have set a moratorium on evictions, there were still farm evictions. I mean, if you look now, you see that many of the farm workers didn't get their TERS money. They didn't get their UIF. They were laid off with any payments because the farm owners thought we are not going to see what is happening because we all were locked down. We were all inside and there was no eyes on them. But I must say the farm worker unions, especially Kasawa, have taken a good look and have take care of the farm workers. And they have, but I mean, it's difficult times. Even farm workers are still feeling the COVID-19 and the side effects of COVID-19. It's not going to get better soon. We have still a long way to go if we talk about the effects, especially on farm workers. And it looked like farm owners haven't even cared about farm workers who didn't have any food on the table during lockdown. Um, just last week, we spoke about the issue of farm shops and how farm workers were really ripped off by these farm shops during lockdown.
Yes.
So I think we really the agriculture side sector. I think government always protected them,
Absolutely.
and not the farm workers.
Absolutely,
Yes.
Dinia. As you say, a long way to go. To you at home, don't go away. We'll be back after this. Welcome back. We're talking the rural poor and COVID-19. Bonani, I want to come to you. Both Dinia and Davina have both described the conditions. But give us a snapshot of how people have actually survived despite the poverty which predates COVID during the time of COVID. Bonani?
The first thing I think which is important is to actually say who was the most affected within the strata of society. And I want to present in our case as in the main, in the communal areas, that the households that are headed by women were most affected. Remember that others depends on the remittances from Cape Town, for instance, in Johannesburg. And most people that were seasonal workers during that time in Cape Town were not bringing money home. And thirdly, they are informal workers, people that are doing their own job during the lockdown period. Those were the second biggest group of people that in our areas happened to lose. But what I can say to respond to your question is that because of a stronger civic society, especially in the part of from Francisco, which is part of around East London towards Port Elizabeth, there was already a prepared intervention because land in particular was normally used to produce food during winter. So there was a lot of adding up to that by the NGOs in that part of the province. But unfortunately, in part of Far Transkei and other parts of it, there was a less intervention from the civil society. But we have to understand that the rural economy for quite some time in history shows that people have been in what is called solidarity economy. So if whatever you have, we can share.
We can share.
This has assisted during this time of this pandemic. There was a less intervention from the state, and I want to elaborate that, because if you go into all your news, what you'll find about food parcel in particular, you'll find that there was a lot of corruption. And the people that benefited from the food parcels were mainly those that are close to political parties or elites. In actual fact, there were cases where an allegation that those that are in government took the food that was intended for the poor. But there are instances where government individuals have decided to close the gap created in the system of the state. So if one asks me the intervention of the state, I would say it's minimal, that individual people within society, and some associated with BE, in fact, decided to contribute and close the gap created by the corruption in the food parcel. And remember that corruption is not only in the food parcel across the country, it was also found in its own space within the health sector.
Bonani, let me just press pause there, and I want to bring Davina into this part of the conversation, particularly around the issue of the food and food security and the food parceling, etc. Davina, according to Stats South Africa, and this is again, the schizophrenic nature of our economy, that even during COVID, during the darkest days of the lockdown, Stats South Africa says that the agricultural sector grew by 15%, and yet the state had to fork out money, and yet farmers were crying, but that sector grew unlike any other sector in the economy. Tell us what you think about, the disconnect between the poverty of rural societies and the increase in the very sector that they've been working in.
Yes, we must remember that sometimes government will say something that is not happening on the ground level. We are living in the area where people are practicing or facing the difficulties. Like, for instance, when lockdown started, most of the farmers just tell the people, no, there's no jobs. You have the right to stay at home without any money, or you can come. And people were confused because they heard about COVID-19. They don't know the pandemic, because it's the first time that they face a pandemic. So for them was a risk to go and work on the farm. We must remember that in the rural areas, especially in the West Coast, there's a lot of migrant foreign nationals that comes into this area. They were here before the lockdown started, and they were taking all the jobs, leaving our people without any jobs. We can't say that they are our enemy, because we are working international, and for the farmers, it was an easy way out to get the cheap laborers to work on the farm through the contractors. And there was no place for people to go and complain, because all the state departments was closed. Department labor was nowhere to be found. Even when people phoned, there's no answer.
Can I bring Dinia? Allow me to bring Dinia into this, because I think you're touching on a very, very sensitive conversation, which is about the competition between poor communities and poor people for the little bit of work that exists. Dinia, give us a sense of how my Boeye Land Rights Forum is dealing with this whole issue, because this is not the first sector in which competition between foreign national workers who are in our country and need to work, and local communities, that this has arisen. It's happened in other sectors and in other industries. How is my Boeye Land Rights Forum dealing with that competition?
As an organization, I think we always believe that poor people should not fight poor people. It should never be a fight between us. Poor should never fight each other. I think the problem lies with the governments, the government of Zimbabwe, the government of Lesotho. The problems lie there. And we cannot ever afford to let it look like that poor people are fighting with each other. I think we believe that our brothers and our sisters are also very vulnerable when they come into South Africa, when they work on farms. They also been excluded from many rights when working rights and labor rights. They also excluded by many of these rights. I think what is important for us to remember as organizations is we have to take the fight where the fight belongs. And the fight belongs to government and all the other governments. That we all are poor, workers are poor. We have middle-class workers that are poor, that are also migrant workers. I always think when you work in another town, in another province, you are also a migrant worker. I also believe that. I think we believe that. And we also integrate the work of migrant workers, the issues of migrant workers, especially migrant worker women. They are the most vulnerable ones who have to sell. Sometimes they have sales to get a job. We have to pay to get a job.
Allow me to bring Bonani into this part of the conversation, because you spoke about migrancy is not just across national borders. Migrancy is also across provincial borders. Bonani, how is Vulumasango Singeni social movement dealing with the issue of interprovincial migrancy, but also migrant workers who may come from other parts of SADC who come and work in rural communities? How are you dealing with that, noting the competition between poor people for work?
Firstly, I would say in terms of number of people that are living in the province, it's evident that they live to Cape Town, because there's a less in terms of economic activity in the province. But when you talk about other people that are coming outside the border of South Africa within the rural space, and the culture that we're trying to inculcate is a culture of saying that we have to welcome each other. There are certain reasons beyond our own controls, which are not only created by the state, by the way, but the big corporates that are actually one that drives the economy. So this is what we take as a package to educate people across.
Bonani, can I ask you to just pause there for a moment? We'll be back after these messages when Bonani will continue his discussion. Welcome back. We're talking rural society, rural communities, rural workers, and the COVID-19 pandemic. Bonani, before the break, you were giving us a sense of this competition that both Dinia and Davinia were touching on between poor people, between poor communities.
Yes. Actually, one of the very important historical argument one can put is that even before you have a flood of spaza shop in our own space, which are under the operation of what one will term someone outside South Africa, but I don't prefer the word foreign if you are from Africa. We have seen a mushroom of what is called malls, which has closed some of the African shops that are within the village, because everything is available on those. And our African brothers came in and have a creative way to revive those kind of business. And their contribution to our own villages in many times is of really having a solidarity with the community. So part of our own education is to actually educate our own communities about that importance of coming together when they now become shop owners, as what is termed foreigners, but they're African brothers.
I want to just, Bonani, I sorry to break your word, but I'm really liking what you've just said now, because I remember at the height of the xenophobic violence in 2008, when Somalian shopkeepers were saying, we bring dignity to these poor communities because you can afford to buy sugar, eggs, bread from us, even if you just have enough for a half a loaf. we will make sure
Yes.
that we can provide that for you. Bonani?
Yes, exactly that. But part of our own education, in fact, popular education, is also to educate those that are our African brothers. How do they appreciate what is called intercultural? Because remember, they come with their own way of doing things, which sometimes become a taboo in our societies. So part of the education that we need to do in order to fight all this, what is called unnecessary competition between the poor, is try to make sure that we understand each other's culture, because it's important for us to do so. So I think I've contributed to that part. But as I have indicated, which is I think is important, the Eastern Cape is one of the provinces that loses its own population to Johannesburg and Cape Town. And I think that's to us it's a pain, because we become a space to bury those that are slaves in Cape Town as well as in Joburg.
It is almost like a youth brain drain and a labor brain drain in the Eastern Cape when everybody goes to what they think is greener pastures. Davina, I want to bring you in here and perhaps just change tack a little bit. There have been parts of the country that still are affected by the drought. I'm talking particularly the Northern Cape and the Eastern Cape. They've also experienced. This must have been more devastating for rural communities who are again now being assaulted by the COVID lockdown conditions. Tell us how your organization has been dealing with, there's the pandemic, but before the pandemic there was a drought, and before the drought there was always poverty.
Yes, we as the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign started our actions over several years now with the government to highlight the drought situation in our area. We face in Cape Town the day zero, and it was scary for us. Even where I'm staying in the West Coast, we get our water from the Glen William Dam. Last year, the dam were 9% full. And if you look at the agricultural sector, most of the water goes to the vineyards. And we don't want wine, we want water to survive. And the Department of Water and Sanitation just put the water restriction after the harvest of the grapes. So the white commercial farmers, they make money, and we suffer because during lockdown we experienced, even in Louisfontein, there were no water. The boreholes just dry up, and they were relying on donor water from other provinces, people that donate water to them for drinking purposes. But the thing is that we really need to speak to government again. Even now, the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign handed over the Climate Justice Charter. And even La Via Campesina is busy with advocacy in the different areas where we look at climate change and climate justice, because government doesn't listen to our people when we speak about the what happened in our area according to drought. So we will face, even today it was 45 degrees. We can't, the heat is getting intense, and the water resources just dry up. But in this time, you can see vineyards are green.
Yeah.
Isn't it important for us to use the water to survive?
Davina, let me bring Dinia. Let me bring Dinia into this part of the conversation, because you're touching on the effects of climate change, access to a common good, which is water, but also the collusion of farm owners to almost limit access or to restrict access to some of these, to the common good of water. Dinia, My Boeye Land Rights Forum, is this one of the struggles that people who live on the land that you organize deal with, access to water?
Yeah, no, it's a big problem. Access to water and access to land and access to food. I mean, there's a big link between water and access to food. If you don't have water, you must be sure you are not going to have access to food. And I mean, all the water licenses are in the hands of the commercial farmers. You get a farm who are next to the river, it belongs to small-scale farmers. and there's no water rights. But just across the river, there's a commercial farmer and he have all the water rights. So where's the justice into equal sharing of the water? Because the winner have said that we need water to survive. We don't need water for wine. We need water so that we can have food and so that we can have something on our table. That's why we want water. We want water for food and water to plant. But as the winner said, the problem are always the commercial farmers are always those ones who have privilege to have enough water. I mean, you can see all the farms who previously was planting food, they are now planting only wine. And how much wine can you drink? How can you support? And these farmers, these buggers, I like to call them these buggers, are so arrogant. I mean, you could see during COVID-19, they didn't care a damn about poor people. I mean, they brag about we give nachkies, we give lemons, we give whatever. But how much nachkies can someone eat? How much lemons can someone eat? How much oranges can someone eat?
Indeed.
I mean, this is not food.
Indeed, Dinia. And I must just say that is exactly the industries that have contributed to that 15% growth. The citrus industry and the pecan nut industry is what helped to grow the agricultural sector despite COVID-19. Bonani, let me bring you in here. So the government, and we've covered this extensively on the Workers' World Labour Show, government has provided various forms of COVID-19 relief for employers, for workers, and for poor communities. Again, yes, in the President's last address to the nation, he spoke again about the extension of COVID-19 relief for particularly poor workers. My question to you, Bonani, is, has this reached the needy in rural areas? And if it hasn't, what were the problems that were experienced?
Okay. Firstly, let me just put an addition. Water in South Africa is not yet liberated. The fact that water question have been taken away from the land reform debate is a problem. About 65% of water goes to agriculture.
Bonani, I'm gonna ask you to pause. I think it was a fantastic intervention, but I'm gonna ask you to pause because I'm getting a message in my ear that we have to go to a break. We'll be back after this. Welcome back. We're talking the rural society and the impact of COVID-19. We've got a wide array of very experienced guests. Bonani, Vulamasinga, Singini, social movement. Before the break, you were firstly commenting on this common good of water, but we also asked you about whether the government's COVID-19 relief has in fact reached needy rural societies.
Let me start first around food, because there was an intervention. They tried to intervene by putting food parcels, which was a once-off event and which never reached, in a sense, sufficient number of the very poor person. A very poor person is one that has only one food a day. And unfortunately, on that score, in this province, there are many families that were left out of food from that intervention. The second one, if everybody recalls, when the 350 was introduced, we have a lot of problems with post office. I know now that there are many people that are receiving it now. So throughout this period, many families were not receiving any intervention. In other words, they were living on begging. And when it comes to issues of UIF, some of the NGOs and other civil society try to assist workers to get the money. Remember, there were those that were retrenched. There were those that were seasonal workers who are from Cape Town and other parts of the country. We have tried as civil society to assist, but things with the Department of Labor were not easy in the province.
Bonani, I want to just interject there, if I may, because what you're describing, we know that the gift of the givers in the Eastern Cape made constant appeals to address the crisis of the extreme hunger, including not only COVID-19, but with the drought. How has the government of the Eastern Cape responded to those appeals as you say, by civil society organization, Gift of the Givers, but also organizations such as the Singine social movement?
Yes. In terms of water, for instance, because I'm in a district where we know every year it's an annual issue, we will not be having water. Government tried to put water through what is called Amatole water, which was full of corruption. And those tanks were put all over in most villages without water. So there were tanks in the communities, but there was no water inside. So some of the intervention that, for instance, the organization that we have mentioned now, there was an act of trying to respond, but you don't respond by putting a container without water. If, for instance, we talk about the most area in Amatole called Butterworth, Namakwa, and Tsendane, where there is no water throughout the years. They have to live, most villages are living in water in the rivers. And those things are there just as a decoration, but there's no water.
Yeah.
So the interventions can come, but they come to make money for an elite, not to respond to the needs of the poor.
So thank you for that, Bonani. I want to bring Davina into this into this part of the conversation now. Davina, as you will know, being part of the Landless People's Movement, being part of Via Campesina, that many Asian, African, and even Latin American countries make sure that there's access to land for subsistence farming at least, so people can feed themselves. Is that the case in South Africa? Is that the case in the Western Cape in particular? Because as we know, the Western Cape is part of the food plate of the country.
We must remember, if we look into our history, that we was displaced from our land. When we look at the other African countries and Asian countries, people are still practicing the indigenous way of farming. The indigenous knowledge are very important for them. So in South Africa, we don't own our own land, and that is very difficult for us, because now what we are doing as civil society is to train people, go back to the indigenous way of farming, because that is the only way to survive, to do agroecology and food sovereignty. Because most of the land belongs to white commercial farmers, and that is a problem that what we are facing is the chemical model of farming, and all the food that they produce is for export and not for people for consumption. And South Africa have a nice food security bill, but the thing is, and even the constitution, they don't make provision for us as a rural poor to survive. We need to look into other mechanisms into our own alternatives and way to survive. But the land distribution issue going to be a long waiting thing. And even if government is giving state land, we are suffering because there's no infrastructure. Even we in the West Coast, we received 2 state farms in 2011. Until today, we can't get access to that land because there's no water, there's no infrastructure. Even the Department of Agriculture said they can't trust us with 1.5 million for the infrastructure. So land in South Africa is a failure, and government, they make sure that small-scale farmers are failures when they receive land. So we need to come on board with alternatives.
Davina, thank you Davina, thank you for that input. I want to, we're in the final segment of our show, so I want to ask each of you the way forward for your individual organizations. The point that Davina makes about a lack of infrastructure to address food security, but also rural societies strengthening their ability to withstand crisis. That does not exist. So your organizations, and let's start with Bonani, what is the next campaign area for your social movement with regard specifically to access greater infrastructure for poor communities in the Eastern Cape?
The first part of our own program for 2021, for instance, is the right to water with its own infrastructure in rural areas. The second part is to champion the whole question of land redistribution in South Africa, because that part of creating an asset for communities. And we make an emphasis that women must lead the list, for they are the brunt of every poverty effects, not of COVID only, but across many other sectors of society. Now we're saying in terms of our own work, that's what we need to champion. But beyond that, our own communities, even if we talk about the farm dwellers, the roads that are there are meant for the bus with big cars, not for them with their own small cars. So infrastructure in rural communities must be a priority, not a joke. When you look to government, 1997, rural strategy, and your 2009 strategy, there was no budget set aside to assist the rural masses. And we are continuing with that trajectory in South Africa.
Thanks for that, Bonani. So water is going to be a big campaign area for the Vula Masango Singeni social movement. Davina, West Coast Food Sovereignty and Solidarity Forum, give us a sense of what your campaign's focus will be for the next period.
Currently, we are busy with advocacy programs on climate justice. We also link up with other social movements in South Africa and also international. La Via Campesina is on point with the climate justice, alternatives, and agroecology. What we want to say to government is that they need to give our land back. We need to use our land to produce our own food to survive during pandemics or to survive wherever it is what happened recently.
Thank you, Davina. Dinia, I can only give you less than 10 seconds. Maibuya Land Rights Forum, your campaign's focus for the next period.
Without land, we will be hunger forever. Okay. And our campaign will always be access to land, access to water, and access to seed. We will keep on campaigning for that because community lands are in the hand of commercial farmers.
Thank you, Dina. Thank you, Dina. Thank you to you at home, and there you have it. We've got the right to water, climate justice, and land as the focus areas for our land and rural communities organizations. To you at home, thank you for joining us on this week's episode of the Workers' World Labour Show. From me, Helga, and the crew here at Cape Town TV, thank you till next time.
Thank you, bye.